Please put your hands together for the one, the only Jodi-Ann Wang. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. And hi, everyone. As introduced, I work at the Grantham Research Institute, where I work on sustainable finance and just transition. And lately, we've been looking more at the extractive sector. And I'm also part of the expert group of resource management under the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And within that, there is two working groups I'm a part of. One is looking at the commercial application of the UN's framework classification for resources, as well as another working group that looks specifically at the intergenerational equity lens of this issue. And what I want to show you today over the next 15 minutes is, one, what does a just transition look like in the extractive sector? And two, what is the role of finance then in making all of this happen? But before that, I think it's helpful for everyone for us to dwell a moment on exactly what we're talking about when we say the word just transition. It originated in the trade union movements, and in 2015, we saw it being included in the Paris Agreement. And then more recently, last year at COP28, there was the operationalization of something called the Work Program on Just Transition Pathways, which then essentially what it does is help bring and help really encourage the embedding of just transition considerations across various works that's been done under the UNFCCC negotiation process. And at the Grantham Research Institute, we've been looking at this issue of just transition and finance for the past 5 years or so. And how we define the just transition is that it actually includes 3 key facets. One is that we need to anticipate, assess, and address the risks of the transition to the low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. But 2, we also need to identify and anticipate the opportunities that the transition can bring. And thirdly, we need to ensure that there's meaningful dialogues and participation for impacted groups. That could be workers, suppliers, communities, consumers, as you see on the screen, but also knowing that in different geographies, in different instances, that stakeholder group and the weighting of each could be different. In terms of applying this in the extractive sector, we need to look at both the transitioning out element, that is transitioning out of coal, and a transitioning in element, just transitioning into energy transition minerals. Both process carry certain risks to it. When we're thinking about coal and the transitioning out of fossil fuels, we know that a lot of workers stand to lose their jobs as part of this process. And they're always not the ones that stand to gain the most if we don't consider them in the deliberate planning process. And similarly, with the transitioning in, that can bring a lot of economic opportunities, but there's also risks with land grab, livelihoods being threatened, loss of sacred land, and also agriculturally productive land, ecosystem and habitat destruction as another example. So we really need to be careful about what this quote unquote green rush to renewables can bring, both in terms of the opportunities and the risks. And ultimately, you see the word system transformation on the screen, and that's something that we're trying to build into the just transition discourse as well. Because at the end of the day, we also need to question the fundamental restructuring that the systems currently need to undo some of the harms that's been going on with the social inequality and the climate crisis. So things like, are we rethinking our production and consumption and growth plans that currently have transgressed 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries? The fossil fuel-based energy system and moving towards a cleaner alternative, unfair international trade relationships that often lock in resource-rich global South countries at the basic level of the value chain, a lack of dignified jobs across various systems, and the inability, after all, to share prosperity across different systems. So that is the just transition. But if we take another step back, what is the just, quote unquote, or justice element of the just transition? Especially in the context of the extractive sector, it comes from a darker history of, colonial contests that require us to not only take a more critical approach at looking at the mechanisms of extraction itself, but also what does justice look like then in reconciling and repairing some of the harms that's been done for centuries. And there are 3 main types of justice that we conceptualize. The first one is distributive justice. Are the impacts and opportunities with the transition affecting different groups similarly? Or are there specific groups that are receiving more harms than others? And there's an example of the overrepresentation of toxic waste sites in communities of color, especially in the United States. There's also the question of procedural justice. Is everybody who needs to be at the table in the decision-making process there? And if not, what does that absence mean in terms of equity outcomes? And the lastly is around recognitional justice. There are different cultural norms and there are different relationships to land, especially when it comes to extractors. Are we taking those into account? Are we recognizing them and learning more about them in this process, especially when it comes to engaging with stakeholders? And each of the three justice that you see on the screen quite nicely linked to the three key facets of the just transition that I mentioned earlier. That's opportunities, risks, and engaging with stakeholders. Now, with all of that understood and clarified, this table here helps us visualize then what does a just transition look like in the extractive sector. We map each of the three key facets against the stakeholder groups, which I've identified here as workers, communities, local economy, and future generations. And if you look at the table in the middle section, what it tells us is that the intersection of each of the key facets and each of the stakeholder group, meaning that we need to take into account every facet for every single stakeholder group. Let's take the example of the top row here, opportunities. For workers, prioritizing stable, decent jobs for the local workforce can be one way of maximizing the opportunities. Existing models like the fly-in, fly-out logic sometimes don't work and can generate mistrust and opposition from the local communities who see that as a threat to local employment. And it also kind of restrains some of the positive spillovers that can happen for local communities. Also, secondly, then if you look one cell to the right, for communities, this can look like mechanisms that enhance that local community or indigenous co-ownership of mines. There's been examples of this being done in Kenya, where indigenous Maasai custodians negotiated 5% of a local wind farm, and that proceeds would then go into a community trust. For local economy, I think in-country value addition gives a really clear example of how we can bring more socioeconomic opportunities to the local economy. So policy measures like fostering backward and forward linkages with other sectors, local content requirements that would support local SMEs in the procurement process, and long-term financing are all mechanisms that can help maximize the opportunities for local economies. And lastly, for future generations, I think Norway's Future Generational Fund is an interesting example where proceeds from extractive of these resources are reinvested into a low-cost index tracking sustainability funds, and the venue of that is then distributed as a dividend to all citizens. And it starts to beg the question of how are we redefining the terms of asset and capital and revenue and returns. Now, it's a shame I can't do full screen because I had a nice little animation across this, but it still does the job. Now that we have a clear picture of what the just transition looks like in the sector, what is the role of investors and what is the role of financial institutions? We're taking investors as an example, and this is a framework that we're proposing in a forthcoming report at the Grantham Research Institute. Mainly, we see investors having two main tools, dialogue and capital allocation. And by dialogue, we really mean dialogue with companies and dialogue with policymakers. Depending on who you want to influence, whether that's national and subnational governments, state-owned enterprises or companies, the way that those leverage points are pulled can be quite different. So for governments, dialogues can be policy advocacy and advocating for policies that are aligned with the just transition through sovereign engagement. Capital allocation could look like incorporating just transition considerations in decision-making in sovereign or sub-sovereign bonds. And for state-owned enterprises, dialogues could happen during bond roadshows or broader sovereign engagement processes, and capital allocation can be done through SOE bond purchasing. And for companies, that may look a bit different, engagement processes, resolutions, voting during annual general meetings, and capital allocation through equity share purchasing, as well as corporate bonds. But also importantly, we need to mention that between governments, state-owned enterprises, and companies, they also have an influence as well. Investors can then advocate, for example, governments to control SOE standards of operation and hold them to the highest standards, both in terms of human rights and labor standards, reducing environmental impacts, requiring community consultation and consent. when it comes to regulating corporate activities, that can look like tightening and enforcing standards on mining companies within territories, as well as companies headquartered domestically that operate abroad. Think in Canada as an example, where 75% of global mining companies are headquartered. Is that a key lever that can pull to maximize impact in terms of standardization and companies' activities? And that can also look like demand management. You know, any mine, however responsibly managed, will have ecological impact to an extent. The European Environment Bureau has recommended the EU set a 65% material footprint reduction target. And I think some of the underlying assumptions behind these targets are quite interesting. So at the end of the day, we also need to look at demand side measures, because we also can't really talk about just transition without discussing things like circular economy principles and tackling wasteful consumerism and right to repair policies that provide consumer access as well. And all of these actions in the sphere influence would ideally contribute towards a just transition in and just transition out in this process. And more importantly, we want to emphasize that this framework itself is not linear. It's an iterative process that investors can use to develop their sector-specific just transition strategy, take lessons learned, engage with relevant actors and evaluate the outcomes, and then use in the process of refining as well. We've seen examples of this being done already. The UK Transition Plans Task Force recent outputs on the mining and metal sector provides an example of this, especially because it combines efforts from standard setters, from NGOs, from mining companies, and from investors as well. And actually, I think stewardship has been provided one of the clear examples of what investors can do in the extractive sector. There are initiatives through Climate Action 100+, Mining 2030, Advance, which all touch on investor engagement with companies. And in the context of transition planning, I think it's a really interesting case because it not only requires entities to establish a net zero commitment, a climate commitment, but also they need to set targets against scenarios and pathways, climate scenarios as well as social scenarios in the transition. And they need to have a time-bound plan of action that deliver against that target. And these plans would require the adequate costing of different implementations and social considerations, particularly on the OpEx side. And so if you look on the graph here on the right-hand side, what the Transition Plans Task Force guidance on mining metal has done is to actually explicitly asking companies to assess and disclose the impacts and dependencies of their transition plans on stakeholders, on society, on the economy. And I think if you have any questions on this, Sarah would be the perfect person to also talk more about the process of conceptualizing this guidance and what it can do for standard setting later on, and how it docks into other global standards, sustainability standards and reporting. Now, I think everything I've said so far sounds quite hopeful, and I've painted a rosy picture of what, you know, the forces of the just transition and what we can do. But actual integration, if we're being realistic, still has a long way to go, particularly given that the history of the extractive sector and that it's been an instrumental part of colonization. And that's something that we cannot forget in thinking about what justice and equity look like then in the sector. So some high level recommendations or things where we can see, you know, the big picture moving that would help better integrate just transition thinking for investors in this process. One is we really need to see more clarified strategy, both around transitioning out of coal and into transition minerals. Transition planning disclosures is one of that tool, but there's also others, like for example, developing better metrics and adoption. And that leads to the second part, which is around standards, tools, common principles, and methodologies that are useful to all stakeholders. This is a landscape that's getting busier and busier. And if we've learned anything from the ESG discussion, is that we need more interoperability and consistency and clarity when it comes to these standards and tools. And with the right with the clarity in metrics, with the clarity in strategy and methodologies, then investors can have more informed engagement with mining companies on just transition in these topics. But I think what is really important to mention here is that we can't really engage our way into a just transition, and we can't really engage our way out of an unjust transition. It's just one of the many tools that is at the disposal of investors. At the end of the day, we also need to see real capital allocation into more sustainable practices as well. And finance, at the end of the day, is a service function for households, for enterprises, for state to achieve the wider sustainability goals. And when we're reconceptualizing what justice means in the sector, I think it will be also really helpful to think about resources, especially minerals, as a form of shared inheritance, whereby governments, as the primary custodian of policies and measures that would enable how we produce and consume, also act as a trustee for the people who are both alive today and future generations, particularly when we think about procedural justice. Many of the future generations who will live with the consequences of the decisions we make today are not going to be here today to voice that opinion. So seeing this as a shared inheritance paradigm then also will allow us to manage these resources for the broader benefit of people and for generations in a much longer time scale of decision making. And at the end of the day, I think achieving a just transition in the extractive sector will really require change in both the mindset, the legal framework, we think of what fiduciary duty is, what profit is, what returns is, and the operating practices, so we can have a more justice-centered financial system that will have positive benefits both in the extractive sector and beyond. I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Jodi, thank you so much. Again, a fantastic talk. Round of applause from all of us. Brilliant. I think we've got time for just one question maybe. And the question came in actually quite early on during your presentation, which is good. And I've gone back and said, do you still want me to ask it? And they've said, yes, please. And this question is, so how can everything that you've been describing drive more effective and responsible partnerships between, say, countries such as the US, the EU, others, and those resource-rich countries to develop and diversify those mineral value chains? So how can this help with that relationship building?
It's a really important, it's definitely like a really, really good question, a really important question. I think I want to answer that with acknowledgement that the current global trade architecture and the global financial architecture has evolved in a way that does not necessarily take into the best interest of resource-rich developing countries. With that being said, embedding a just transition framework in this incremental change process can at least unearth some of the unearth and center the interest of local communities who are part of the countries that are seeking opportunities to not only export their resources, but also have broader social and economic development processes. And we go back to the question of in-country value addition. I think through engagement processes, these need will come out and investors can better understand through their dialogues that if these are the gaps that are needed for current policy, then they can take that into their policy advocacy processes as well. But I think at the end of the day, we'll keep running into walls knowing that the architecture and the infrastructure in the system today is not necessarily compatible with that value chain thinking yet that maximize benefits for the downstream.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jodi-Ann, and thank you very much for giving your talk again. Round of applause, everybody. Absolutely brilliant. Fantastic.